For Action News, I'm Anna Samovska. Former Vice President of Infectious Disease Research at Wyeth and ACSHA advisor Dr. David Schlaze knows a thing or two about dealing with the FDA and their misguided policies regarding the approval of new antibiotics. Our interview with Dr. Schlaze gives an overview of a very serious regulatory problem, which could have been prevented. His newest commentary has just been accepted in the prestigious journal Antimicrobial Agents and Chemotherapy, where Dr. Schlaze discusses the escalating crisis of antibiotic resistance and FDA's effort to reboot their policies. Why hasn't the FDA been successful in its trials? Dr. Schlaze says the trials simply aren't feasible.
They had requirements, for example, for prohibiting the use of all prior antibiotics. So there are two problems. I mean, one is people get sick, they call their physicians, and physicians prescribe antibiotics over the phone sometimes. So by the time the patient is sick enough to actually get to an emergency room or get to a hospital where they might be enrolled in a trial, they've already had 1 or 2 doses of antibiotic from the physician. The FDA's worry is, well, how do I know that that 1 dose or 2 doses of prior antibiotic didn't affect the whole course of antibiotic therapy? How do I know it was the new drug and not the old drug? Well, and the answer is you probably don't know totally. Plus, you have a number of laboratory tests you have to get to make sure that the patient fits all the criteria to be enrolled. The other thing that the FDA did was they increased the stringency of the trials, the statistical stringency. And what that did was it increased the cost of trials because it increased the number of patients you had to study. So it made antibiotics even less attractive financially than they were to companies to begin with.
Meanwhile, the problem has worsened in hospitals, where ACSHA's Dr. Josh Bloom says many infections aren't treatable.
Anytime you use an antibiotic, by definition, you will generate resistant organisms. It's just a matter of time, a function of the bacteria, and how properly the antibiotic is used. But it's going to happen one way or the other. So really the only way to stay ahead of this is to keep finding new antibiotics. And due to the breakdown in sanity in the FDA in the 90s, companies just said, we can't do this anymore. It's not financially feasible. It's just crazy. And they all dropped out, and there are very few people left. So now we got a 15-year hole in the pipeline with very little in there.
He applauds Schlaze, a former boss and colleague, for his efforts in working with the FDA and solving the crisis.
He's actually responsible for this Herculean effort that it took to get an antibiotic that came out of my group in the early 90s to market. It's called Tigasil. It was stopped and started by the company a number of times because the FDA was just being crazy with all their rules and regulations. Dave somehow managed to hang in there without losing his mind entirely and finally convinced the FDA to allow approval of Tigasil, and has spent an awful lot of time at the FDA talking to them, lobbying them, and just trying to beat some sense into their head.
So how does the FDA actually turn this around? What does it mean to reboot?
So the first thing in their reboot, the first thing the FDA did was actually come out with this new guidance that came out in July, which talks about how to get these antibiotics to these particular patients with high unmet needs, that is, with very resistant infections. And they say in their guidance that we understand we're not going to study as many patients. We're going to have an increased risk that we'll run into toxicity or some other problem that didn't come out during these smaller trials. But this was something that was very well discussed at the Brookings Institution and many other fora with the FDA, and they, as part of this reboot process, were willing to go forward with.
Of course, hitting the reset button for the FDA is only the beginning. Enticing large drug companies to invest again in antibiotic research after they've previously backed out is yet another challenge down the road. To read the full commentary from Dr. Schlaze, head to our website, acsha.org. For ACSHA, I'm Anna Samovska.